Well, hello, dear friend. Come sit with me a moment and mind the stove. It's been going since early this morning, the way it does most days. And I think today's story is a fitting one to tell beside it, because I want to talk to you about burns and about all the ways my mother and the women in our community tended to them long before any of us had a hospital close enough to visit in a hurry. Living the way we lived, with wood stoves in every kitchen, with irons heated directly on those stoves for pressing clothes, with kettles of boiling water hauled this way and that throughout the day, and with open flames lighting nearly every room come evening, burns were simply a part of life. Not a week went by, especially in a household with as many children as ours, without someone catching a finger against a hot pan, or a hand brushing too close to the stove, or a splash of boiling water finding its way onto bare skin. My mother had seen and treated more burns than I could ever count, and she approached each one with a calm, practiced confidence that I think came only from years and years of experience. Before I share what she did, let me remind you, as I always do, that I'm telling you these things from memory and from family tradition, not from any medical training of my own. If a burn is severe, if the skin blisters badly, if it covers a large area, if it's deep enough to look white or charred rather than simply red, or if it happens to a small child or an elderly person whose skin is more vulnerable, please see a doctor immediately. Burns can be far more dangerous than they first appear, and my mother herself, despite everything she knew, always understood the difference between a burn she could tend herself and one that needed far more than her remedy box could provide. But for the ordinary burns, the small kitchen accidents and minor scalds that happen in any busy household, let me tell you what we did. The very first thing my mother always did, without exception, the moment any of us cried out from a burn, was reach for cold water. I want to emphasize this because I think it's perhaps the single most important thing she taught any of us, repeated so many times throughout my childhood that it became almost instinctive even for us children. The moment skin meets heat, you get it under cool water, and you keep it there. She'd rush whoever was burned to the pump or the nearest basin, holding the burned area under a steady stream of cool water, never ice cold, just cool, and she'd hold it there for what felt like a very long time to an impatient child eager to see how bad the damage was, often 10 minutes or more, sometimes longer for a worse burn. She believed firmly that this immediate cooling made all the difference in how a burn ultimately healed. That stopping the heat from continuing to damage the skin beneath the surface mattered more than almost anything else that came afterward. I remember her holding my own hand under that cool water once, after I'd carelessly grabbed a pot handle that had been sitting too close to the fire, and I remember crying and trying to pull away, wanting only to see the damage and perhaps wrap it in something, anything, rather than stand there feeling the cool water running over what felt like a genuinely painful burn. But she held firm, her grip gentle but absolutely unmovable, telling me quietly that this was the most important part, that we'd tend to everything else once the water had done its work. Once the burned area had been properly cooled, and once she'd assessed how serious the burn actually was, judging by the color of the skin and whether any blistering had begun, she'd move on to whatever remedy she judged most appropriate for that particular burn. For the mildest burns, the kind that left skin simply red and tender without any blistering, her go-to remedy was honey, the same honey she trusted for so many other ailments in our household. She'd spread a thin layer directly over the burned skin, then cover it loosely with a clean cloth, explaining that honey had a particular property that helped protect the skin while it healed, drawing out whatever heat remained and creating a kind of natural barrier against infection. I remember being skeptical of this remedy the first time I watched her apply it to my own brother's burned forearm, wondering how something so sweet and sticky could possibly help an injury. But she explained, with the patient confidence she brought to nearly everything, that honey had been trusted for this purpose for longer than anyone could properly trace, passed down through generations of women who'd observed again and again that wounds and burns treated with honey seemed to heal more cleanly, with less likelihood of the kind of infection that could turn a minor burn into something far more serious. For burns that had progressed beyond simple redness into blistering, my mother became considerably more careful, and this is where her approach shifted toward gentler, more protective measures. She never popped a blister deliberately, believing firmly that the blister itself served an important protective function, shielding the more vulnerable skin beneath while it healed. Instead, she'd apply aloe if we happened to have a plant growing in the window, which we did most years, my mother tending a small aloe plant on the kitchen windowsill specifically for this purpose, among others. She'd break off a piece of the thick, fleshy leaf, split it open to reveal the cool, clear gel inside, and apply this directly to the burned area, finding that it brought genuine, immediate relief from the stinging, burning sensation that lingered long after the initial injury. When we didn't have aloe available, or when the burn covered an area larger than what our single small plant could adequately treat, she'd turn again to honey, applying it more generously over blistered burns, always covering the area afterward with a clean, loose cloth to protect it from dirt and further irritation, while still allowing some air to reach the wound. She checked these dressings regularly, changing them at least daily, sometimes more often if the burn seemed to be producing much in the way of fluid, always watching carefully for any sign that infection might be setting in. Increased redness spreading beyond the original burn, warmth radiating from the area, or any sign of pus or unusual discharge that would worry her enough to consider whether more serious help was needed. I want to tell you about a particular practice my mother followed that fell somewhat outside what most people today would recognize as conventional remedy work, something she called blowing out the fire, which formed part of what our community sometimes referred to as brauch or powwowing. This wasn't something every family practiced, and even within our own community, opinions varied considerably about whether it represented genuine, helpful tradition or something that bordered too closely on superstition for comfort. My mother held a measured view on this herself, practicing it sometimes, but never relying on it exclusively, always combining it with the more straightforward physical remedies I've already described. The practice itself involved a particular person, sometimes my mother herself, sometimes an older woman in our community known specifically for this particular skill, who would hold her hands close to the burn without quite touching it, speaking certain quiet words, sometimes verses from Scripture, sometimes phrases passed down through generations that I never fully understood the origin of, and gently blowing across the burned area while doing so. I remember experiencing this myself once, after a particularly painful burn from a spilled pot of boiling water, and I remember the strange, almost peaceful sensation it brought, whether from whatever the practice itself accomplished, or simply from the calm, focused attention of someone working slowly and deliberately to ease my pain. I won't pretend to explain to you how or why this particular practice might work, if indeed it works at all beyond the simple comfort of focused attention and quiet ritual. My mother herself never claimed certainty about it, only that she'd seen it bring comfort time and again to burns being treated in our community, and that the women who practiced it most skillfully seemed to carry a particular calm, a particular confidence that itself seemed to ease the fear and panic that often accompanies a sudden painful burn. Some families I knew avoided this practice entirely, considering it too close to something beyond what their faith comfortably allowed, while others embraced it fully, treating it as simply another tool in the larger collection of remedies available to ease suffering. I think there's room for both views, and I share this with you simply as part of the full, honest picture of what burn treatment looked like in our community, not as something I'm asking you to believe or practice yourself. Let me tell you about a particular incident I remember vividly from my own childhood, one that taught me something important about how seriously my mother took the matter of burns, and how carefully she distinguished between what she could treat herself and what required more than her remedy box could offer. My younger brother, who must have been about 6 years old at the time, pulled a pot of boiling water down onto himself while reaching for something on the stove, scalding a fairly large area of his arm and a portion of his side. I remember the chaos of that moment clearly, his screaming, my mother's quick, decisive movements as she rushed him to the pump, holding the burned area under cool water far longer than usual, given the severity of what had happened. Her face set in a calm but serious expression that told all of us children, without her needing to say a word, that this was more serious than the usual minor kitchen burn. After the cooling, she examined the burn carefully, and I remember her expression shifting from calm focus to genuine concern as she assessed how large the area was and how deeply it seemed to have damaged the skin. Rather than reaching for her usual honey or aloe, she immediately sent my older sister running to fetch my father from the fields, and within the hour My brother was in the back of our buggy, wrapped carefully in cool, damp cloths, on his way to see a doctor in town. My mother riding alongside him the entire way, her hand resting gently on his forehead, speaking softly to keep him calm. I remember asking her, once everyone had returned home and my brother was recovering properly under a doctor's care, why she hadn't simply treated this burn the way she treated all our other burns and scrapes over the years. She told me something that has stayed with me clearly across all the years since, and that I think captures something essential about real wisdom in matters of health and healing. She said that she knew her remedies well, knew exactly what they could accomplish, and exactly where their limits lay, and that a burn of that size and depth, covering so much of his arm and side, was simply beyond what cool water and honey could properly address. She said that real wisdom wasn't in knowing every remedy, but in knowing precisely when those remedies had reached their limit, and having the humility and the courage to seek further help without delay or hesitation when that limit had been reached. I think about that lesson often, especially now, given how readily available proper medical care has become for most people, in ways my mother could only have dreamed of during her own lifetime. I find myself grateful, genuinely grateful, that families today rarely face the same difficult calculations my mother faced, weighing the time and difficulty of reaching a doctor against the severity of an injury, trying to judge correctly in a moment of crisis exactly how serious something truly was. But I also believe that her underlying wisdom remains just as relevant now as it was then. Knowing the limits of home remedies, recognizing quickly when something has moved beyond what simple home care can address, and never letting pride, stubbornness, or excessive faith in old traditions delay seeking proper medical help when it's truly needed. I want to tell you, too, about some of the everyday precautions my mother took to prevent burns in the first place, because I think prevention formed just as important a part of her overall approach as treatment did once a burn had already happened. She was meticulous about keeping pot handles turned inward on the stove, away from the edge where a careless hand or a curious child might bump against them. She kept us children at a careful distance from the stove itself during cooking, assigning specific tasks that kept us occupied elsewhere in the kitchen rather than underfoot near the heat. She taught each of us from a very young age to always test the temperature of bath water carefully before stepping in, and to never, under any circumstances, attempt to move a heated iron or a pot of boiling water without an adult present to supervise. These precautions, woven so thoroughly into our everyday household routine that we barely noticed them as children, prevented far more burns than any remedy ever needed to treat. And I think this matters to mention because I believe the old wisdom around burns was never really just about what to do after an injury had already happened. It was equally, perhaps even more importantly, about the careful, attentive habits that prevented so many burns from occurring in the first place. habits my mother modeled constantly and taught us patiently, year after year, until they became simply part of how we moved through our own kitchens and around our own stoves, even decades later, in households entirely our own. I hope in telling you all of this today that you've come away with more than simply a list of remedies for treating a burn, though I do hope the cool water, the honey, and the aloe prove useful to you should you ever need them. I hope you've come away, too, with a sense of the careful wisdom my mother carried regarding burns specifically, the immediate instinctive reach for cool water, the gentle protective treatments for milder injuries, the humility to recognize when something had moved beyond her abilities, and the constant, careful attention to prevention that kept so many burns from ever needing to be treated at all. I want to remind you before I let you go today, just as I always do, that these are old remedies and old practices from a different time, passed down through a family and a community that often had little else to rely on. If you or someone you love suffers a burn that seems severe in any way, large in size, deep in the skin, blistering badly, or simply causing concern that goes beyond what feels manageable, please seek medical attention promptly. That is simply wisdom, every bit as important now as it was when my mother knew precisely when her own careful remedies had reached their limit. But for the ordinary minor burns that happen in any busy household, the small kitchen accidents, the careless brush against something too hot, I hope there's something here today worth remembering. Cool water first and always, followed by gentle protective care, and the same patient attention that my mother brought to absolutely everything she did for the people she loved. I want to tell you, too, about how my mother distinguished between different kinds of burns, because not every burn in our household came from the same source, and she adjusted her approach somewhat depending on exactly what had caused the injury. A burn from dry heat, like touching a hot stove or a heated iron, she treated essentially the way I've already described, with immediate cooling, followed by honey or aloe, depending on severity. But a scald from boiling water or hot grease she always treated with a touch more caution, believing these injuries tended to penetrate deeper into the skin even when they didn't necessarily look worse on the surface at first glance. For scalds especially, she'd extend that initial cooling period even longer than usual, sometimes keeping the affected area under cool running water for 15 minutes or more, explaining that liquid burns carried heat differently than dry burns did, settling into the skin in a way that needed extra time and extra cooling to properly counteract. She also held particular caution around grease burns, the kind that happened occasionally when frying something on the stove and a splash of hot fat landed on bare skin. These, she always said, tended to cling to the skin in a way plain water didn't, continuing to burn even after the initial splash, and she taught us all to immediately wipe away any visible grease with a clean cloth before beginning the cooling process, rather than simply running water over a grease-covered burn, which she believed could actually spread the hot fat further across the skin rather than washing it away cleanly. This was one of those small but important distinctions that I don't think gets discussed often when people talk about old home remedies in general terms, but that mattered tremendously in the actual moment of treating a real injury in a real kitchen. I remember, too, a particular remedy my grandmother favored for burns, slightly different from my mother's preferred honey and aloe, involving a paste made from baking soda mixed with just enough water to form a thick consistency, applied to a burn once the initial cooling period had finished. She believed this drew out heat that remained trapped beneath the skin even after the cooling water had done its work. And though my mother used this particular remedy less often than her own preferred methods, she didn't dismiss it either, sometimes combining approaches depending on the particular burn and what ingredients happened to be readily available in a given moment. I think this flexibility, this willingness to draw on multiple traditions within the family, rather than insisting on a single fixed method, characterize much of how these remedies actually functioned in practice, despite how clean and consistent they might sound when described simply, the way I've been describing them to you today. There's another memory I want to share with you, one involving a neighbor woman in our community who was particularly skilled and well known for her ability to treat burns, someone families would send for specifically when a burn seemed worse than what they felt confident treating themselves, even when it perhaps hadn't yet reached the point of needing an actual doctor. This woman, considerably older than my mother, had a particular reputation built over decades of experience, and I remember the quiet respect with which my mother spoke of her, never treating her own knowledge as somehow superior or complete, always acknowledging that this other woman had seen things, treated things, that she herself hadn't encountered in her own more limited experience. I was present once when this woman came to treat a burn on one of our farm hands, a young man who'd suffered a fairly serious scald while working near a large pot used for scalding hogs during butchering season. I watched her work with a kind of quiet, practiced confidence that even my own mother, skilled as she was, seemed to defer to in that moment. She examined the burn carefully, asked several pointed questions about exactly how it had happened and how long ago, and then began a treatment that combined several elements I recognized from my own mother's practice: the cooling, the honey application, even a brief period of the quiet, focused, blowing out practice I mentioned earlier, but executed with a confidence and thoroughness that came only from having done this particular work countless times before. Afterward, my mother asked her several questions, genuinely curious to learn whatever additional wisdom this more experienced woman might share. And I remember sitting quietly nearby, listening to two skilled women discuss the finer points of burn treatment with the same serious attention some might bring to discussing scripture or the proper raising of children. This exchange of knowledge between women, this constant willingness to learn from one another, regardless of age or established reputation, strikes me now as an essential part of how these remedies survived and improved across generations, never simply static or unchanging, but constantly refined through shared experience and genuine humility about the limits of any single person's knowledge. I think in the end, this willingness to keep learning, to defer to greater experience when it was available, and to combine different approaches based on the specific situation rather than rigid adherence to a single method, represents something genuinely valuable about how my mother and the women of her generation approached not just burns specifically, but healing in general. They held their traditions seriously, trusted them deeply, and passed them down faithfully, but they never treated that tradition as a closed book, finished and complete. It remained always something living, something that could grow through careful observation, through learning from more experienced neighbors, and through the simple, ongoing process of caring for people they loved, through whatever injuries and illnesses life happened to bring their way. I hope in sharing all of these additional memories and details with you today, that you've gained a fuller picture of just how much careful thought, tradition, and genuine wisdom surrounded the treatment of burns in our community, far beyond what might first appear to be a simple matter of cool water and a bit of honey. There was nothing simple in truth about any of it, not when you consider the careful distinctions between different kinds of burns, the humble willingness to learn from more experienced neighbors, and the constant careful attention to both treatment and prevention that defined my mother's entire approach to keeping her family safe and healthy through all the ordinary hazards of farm life.